Good evening and welcome. This is a recorded session forming part of the first of the conversational talks on the theme of faith in the public square, being organized by the Diocese of New York. And this evening we're going to be talking about the role of exile and refuge and travel in the shaping of the spirituality of the Church of England tradition, which is at the root of the Anglican and Episcopal tradition, and in particular, the role that international contacts of various kinds played in the forming of the Book of Common Prayer, which is obviously the key document in our identity as an Episcopal Church. Now, I am very, very delighted indeed to say that the conversation partners whom I invited to take part this evening both agreed very, very readily, and I'm enormously grateful to them both. We have my very good friend over many, many years, Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch from the University of Oxford. To list his books would take more time than we have, but let's just say that some years back, Diarmaid published what is still, I think, the definitive biography of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and more recently also a biography of Thomas Cromwell, as well as major works which cover the story of the Reformation, both the later Reformation in England, the story of the Reformation under King Edward, and the whole story of the European Reformation, and as well, of course, as a major single-volume history of Christianity. He has just published a work entitled Lower Than the Angels, a history of sex and Christianity, which is both timely and based on many, many years of thoughtful study. Our other conversation partner, I'm equally delighted to welcome, and we've known each other intermittently for some time, is Professor Polly Ha of Duke Divinity School, whom I first met through a conference which she helped to organize, which became an edited volume entitled The Reception of Continental Reformation in Britain, organized along with the late, great, and much loved doyen of late Tudor and 17th century church history, Patrick Collinson. Polly has also published a volume on English Presbyterianism and recently a scholarly edition of a historic text under the title Reformed Government, Puritanism, Historical Contingency, and Ecclesiastical Politics. My name is Euan Cameron, and I am a priest ordained in the Diocese of New York and now serving in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. For 20 years, I taught the history of the Reformation and church history more generally in Union Theological Seminary in New York, and I published a book or two on the subject down the years. So we'll launch straight into this conversation. We will, broadly speaking, follow the story of the Reformation in the English context and in the English language lands, beginning from the beginning of the 16th century, the beginning of the 1500s, continually circling back to the role that travel and exchange and the receiving and being received as travelers and refugees played in our story. So, if I may, Diarmaid, can I invite you to set the scene for us at the beginning of the story of the Reformation?
Thank you, Euan. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We need to think what England was at the beginning of all this process, at the beginning of the 16th century. It was a marginal island in the great continent of Europe. It wasn't really a major player, though its monarch for most of that time, King Henry VIII, thought of himself as a big boy. He wasn't one of the big boys. He wasn't like the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, or the King of Poland. But all through the story of the early Reformation, his wish to impose himself on Europe was really part of the story. So here's a marginal place. It is an island on the edge of what became the Reformation. And therefore, it took its cues from the Reformations elsewhere, the Reformations in Germany, the Reformations in Switzerland. And therefore, travel was really important in this story. Travel, often involuntary travel, you might say. Exile, refuge, finding a place where you were safe. And that began in England very soon after Martin Luther created his Reformation in Germany. I'll lay down one other bit of basic information we need to chuck into this story. First, we're not talking about Anglicanism in the 16th century. That's a much later term describing something which evolved from this story. We're talking about Protestantism of two major sorts, one of which was that of Martin Luther, up in the little university town of Wittenberg in northern Germany, but another Reformation in Central Europe, in Switzerland, in southern Germany, which you might just call not Lutheran, but that's not a very positive name, and one name which was used at the time and still is used in such parts of Protestantism is Reformed with a capital R. Some of that Reformed Protestantism is often called Calvinism, but I think we keep the word Reformed. So keep those two things in mind. Lutheranism, Reformed Protestantism. Where would England fit in this? To begin with, clearly it wouldn't know. Martin Luther had just done something remarkable, 1517 onwards, in standing up against the papacy, and England gradually was affected by that. And one man in particular stands out as the first exile important in our story, William Tyndale, an Englishman determined to create an English Bible. But he could only do it outside England, with its determined traditional regime in church and commonwealth. He could only do it in Europe, mainland Europe, that is, principally in Antwerp. He was influenced by Martin Luther, but struck out in many ways on his own. So we need to name check William Tyndale, and we need to see what he did, which was to begin the process of creating the English Bible in all its various 16th and 17th century forms, which is the basis of all English-speaking Protestantism. So I lay on the table for you William Tyndale to start with.
Yep. And he has to move around quite a bit. Really, I mean, it's a very unsafe time, even in Germany, isn't it?
Oh, well, absolutely so, because the Holy Roman Emperor, who was not just Holy Roman Emperor, but the chief political figure in the Low Countries, was extremely hostile to what was happening. So Tyndale wasn't entirely safe at all in his exile. Probably safer than he would be in England, but in the end, as it tragically proved, he was executed by the Emperor Charles V, in 1536.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how we see with Tyndale, him being joined by a number of other English exiles. You get all of the Johns, John Bale, John Hooper, John Rogers, and their movement also shaping his continued revision of his translations. We think about him picking up Hebrew, 7 languages, just in such an astonishingly gifted way. But I think the revisions of his translation are testament to the continued revisions that are going on real time in a dynamic way. And so I think that the debates between Luther and some of the Reformed interjecting into the English experience as they're listening to those debates between Zwingli and Luther, and they're there in, present on the scene.
Yeah.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. I'll throw in two more crucial figures. Well, I've mentioned Henry VIII already as the difficulty in the situation, but let's name Thomas Cranmer, whom Henry VIII chose as his archbishop, really simply to have a compliant clergyman to get him his first marriage annulled. But Cranmer had his own agenda, and it turned out to be resonating with Reformation in mainland Europe. I'll also name the other person of whom I've written a biography, Thomas Cromwell, chief minister through most of the 1530s to the king, often seen as a cool, secular, cynical figure, but no, a man absolutely committed to Protestant Reformation and exploring what that might mean for England. So we've got Cranmer and Cromwell pushing their own agendas while serving the king. It's a very complicated situation. And I would maintain that both Cranmer and Cromwell, who are, of course, sitting in England through the 1530s, are the people chiefly in touch with these various reformers in exile that Polly has mentioned, and I've mentioned William Tyndale, using their thought and also deciding what that meant for the direction of the Reformation, which they could add to Henry VIII's own plans. And spoiler alert, the end of the story is to the Reformed side of the Protestant Reformation, not to the Lutheran side. Cromwell, in particular, was extremely important in directing England's religious energies towards a city which had never really had any contact with England at all. It is the Swiss city of Zurich. And Cromwell was the man who set up contacts between Zurich and England in the 1530s.
Yes. Of course, we think of Cranmer and Cromwell chiefly in terms of their work in England, but they both travelled quite a bit before their careers really took off, hadn't they? They'd built a lot of those overseas connections.
Yes, Cromwell in particular, he absolutely extraordinary, cultured, cosmopolitan man. I think that's why the English nobility hated him so much. They saw he had much more experience of life than they did. And in particular, in Italy,
Mhm.
he was the best Italian in Tudor England, having gone to Italy when he was a teenager and mysteriously acquired an education there. So he got all sorts of contacts all through Europe, from southern Europe through into the Low Countries, where he'd been a merchant in the years before William Tyndale got there. So that he is a sort of spider in the middle of the web. But Cranmer also, a man who in his travels as an ambassador for King Henry VIII, acquired a wife in Germany, in the city of Nuremberg. And her uncle was the chief theologian pushing forward the Lutheran Reformation in Nuremberg, though he turned out to be a bit of a maverick. So, yes, these two people have an extraordinary cosmopolitan gift to give insular little England on the side in its
Mhm.
Reformation.
Yeah.
I
Taking
think
us.
of when you spoke, Dermot, about just the story of England, it made me think of the whole of English history really being one of constant migration, where we have it's a story of amalgamation of these different traditions. And I think the same is true of what you just mentioned about how we tend to draw these broad contours of Christian humanism through Erasmus's visit to Cambridge and yet, here we have this Italian Renaissance thought that is often underplayed, the Machiavellian politics that they're in touch with in Italy. And there's so much to the story that gets kind of redacted out through the broad sweeping narratives that I think is wonderful to see through the careers of these politicians who are traveling to many different spots all over the continent.
Yeah. One of the critical things that comes out of what we've already been discussing is that, as it turns out, once obviously the Reformation in England follows a rather complicated and winding course, but it does end up being, as you mentioned, Dermot, it ends up being reformed. But that's not without some, as it were, preliminary flirtations, not with Martin Luther, because he and Henry VIII had a warm mutual detestation of long
Hmm.
standing, but Lutheranism is a possibility in England. And why do we feel that doesn't work out?
Well, I think another exile needs to be thrown in, or what you might call a part-time exile. His name was Robert Barnes.
Hmm.
He'd been a leading An Augustinian friar in the 1520s, fled at the end of the 1520s into Europe and in particular to Wittenberg. And Barnes really knew what Luther was doing and was very enthusiastic for him. And so he's a presence in all this through the 1530s, sometimes in England, sometimes in Germany, sometimes being an ambassador for King Henry, sometimes being an ambassador to England for German princes. He's a very kaleidoscopic figure
Mm.
who clearly a major personality, but in 1540, when King Henry had a violent revulsion against the Reformation and in his violent anger killed his great chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, Barnes was also a victim. He was burned at the stake with great spite by Henry VIII for being a heretic, and there was no longer a great voice for Lutheranism in England from 1540. My former student, who all of us here know, Alec Ryrie, has called this the strange death of Lutheran England. And from then on, the stage was sort of cleared for Reformed Protestantism to encounter Archbishop Cranmer still hanging on in there under Henry VIII and pulling the future of the Reformation forward into the next reign of Henry VIII's son.
Yeah.
I can add to this that there's a sense in which, as we I think of the story fast forwarding to Cranmer's later career, this attempt to mediate between these traditions, the Lutheran and Reformed, continues to be an aspiration. And there's a long-standing reception of Luther's works across the 16th century into the 17th century that get funneled back and actually inject, a pietism later on into Central Europe. So there's a sense in which this kind of engagement early on with Tyndale and others on the continent continues back in England as they continue to think of themselves almost
Mm.
as this mediating partner.
I came across an interesting example of that, as it were, afterlife of Lutheranism in England when I was looking at the paraphrases of Erasmus, which were published in 1548, I think, uh, in English.
In English,
And
yeah.
in the paraphrase of Romans, you have a prelude to Romans, and it's actually a very much reworked version of Luther's preface to Romans from his 1522 German Bible.
Mhm.
Unacknowledged,
Mm.
uncredited, but there it is. There is at the same time, let me just sort of indulge me to narrate for a moment. There's something that goes on in the continent, which is an unexpected collision of factors, which brings the continental Reformed tradition into the sight of the English policymakers and Cranmer in particular. In 1546, Luther dies. In 1547, Henry VIII dies, being succeeded, of course, by his very much underage son, Edward VI, under the tutelage of the Seymour dynasty at that time. And also in 1547, there is a campaign by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, to try to take control of the religious situation in Germany by force. He defeats the Protestant League of Schmalkalden, I think we can call it Protestant by this stage, in battle at Mühlberg, and essentially takes control of Luther's Saxony. There's a story that Charles had a moment as it were, of generosity to the dead, and was asked, did he want to, if, as it were, to tear Luther out of his tomb? And he said, no, let's not do that. But the result is that Charles has control over the religious situation in Germany. And what ends up happening is that since it's impossible to suppress Lutheranism, Lutheranism becomes the officially endorsed religion in the empire alongside Roman Catholicism. This is eventually sort of formalized in 1555. Meanwhile, a lot of Reformed theologians who were not in the Swiss Confederation, but were in southern and western Germany, cities like Strasbourg and the rest of the towns of Swabia, they're all losing their jobs. Steadily, their situation becomes more and more uncomfortable. And into this scene comes Thomas Cranmer with some
Yeah,
invitation.
extraordinary, and this is a big turnaround in England at the same. So many times, as you've outlined, so many things are turning round in 1546-7, and the accession of young Edward, only 10 years old, he was being led by politicians who turned out to be very much committed to the Reformation, and suddenly, therefore, England was the largest surviving Protestant polity in all Europe. And it was a refuge, a haven for some of the biggest names in the earliest Reformation. You've mentioned Strasbourg. Well, the chief pastor of Strasbourg came, Martin Butzer. We could also point to an Italian Protestant, Peter Martyr Vermigli, who had been one of the stars of the early Catholic Reformation, now turned Protestant. So these are really important people that Cranmer has around him. And Cranmer had actually been in touch by letter with Martin Butzer since 1531. So this is a real gift to Cranmer. He can talk to these reformers from all over Europe. Another name we could throw in is a Polish Protestant, an aristocratic bishop who had left the Roman Catholic Church and become a chief pastor in Germany, Johannes Alasko, Jan Łaski. So these are really important people in conversation at a crucial moment of the English Reformation, which gave us the first two versions of the English Book of Common Prayer, the ancestor of the Episcopal prayer book.
I think that, the way you've written about this, Dermot, as something that Cranmer's actively recruiting. He wants his dream team. And if he wants to see England as sort of flagship of Protestantism that can bridge these divisions and bring some solidarity, and he has the star ecumenical figure, Butzer, coming to England, he's got a winning team. And this idea that he's in prime recruiting season where England is able to host these academic stars and lights and reformers it shows the role of the universities, it shows the role of learning in bringing these conversations together in a way that Cranmer really believes can bridge these divisions.
Conversation's a very interesting word, Polly, because we have to remember, and our audience needs to remember, but not something apparently obvious. How could they communicate? Well, they all spoke Latin to each other. It is a university world in that sense. They are fluent in Latin. There could not have been a Reformation without Latin. Of course, the other thing to say is that the team is skewed, this dream team. It is all reformed, even Butzer. And the real litmus test is what you think goes on in the Eucharist, the service of Holy Communion. Are you creating the body and blood of Christ on a table? Or are you investing in a symbol, a very powerful symbol in which bread and wine stand for the body and blood of Christ? Now, Luther would say, just as the Pope would say, this is the body and blood of Christ. The Reformed won't say that. They will begin any sort of sentence about the Eucharist. Well, it depends what you mean by presence,
Well,
Christ's presence. And its symbol, which is important for them, even for Butzer, who actually just couldn't stop talking. And within this welter of words, you still see a reformed view of the Eucharist.
and you see Cranmer's evolution of his Eucharistic theology through that conversation,
Sure.
his starting point and his ending point through that time it evolves.
Yeah, sure. Lutheran, more or less, under Henry VIII, but a subtle change, 46-7, towards the Reformed position. That's a real shift. And that's the mood in which he was creating the books of common prayer.
That
And I
brings
love
us.
that this is the sort of layered conversation. I mean, we spoke about kind of amalgamation. I tend to think about it being helpful to see it as a sort of layered composition. we're probably going to turn to the Book of Common Prayer and its
Yeah.
composition soon. And when I think about Cranmer's looking at some of the sources that these reformers are bringing with him, right? The crucial Chrysostom manuscript that he sees that helps him to evolve in his thinking about the Eucharist. To me, it's an interesting moment when you don't just simply have this contemporary debate, but you have a whole dialogue with church history. You have a composite of so many layers, not just of the medieval, but also of the early church, all part of that discussion as they're composing and revising these liturgical traditions.
I wonder if I can be devil's advocate here a little bit. Um, there are those who have been raised on a very, as it were, nationalistic story of the Book of Common Prayer, that it is heavily based on taking some of the most poetic and most appropriate passages from the Sarum Rite, which of course is really four books: the Missal, the Breviary, the Manual, and the Pontifical. And you can see Cranmer translating from some of those texts if you compare the medieval liturgy. And of course, the other thing that is sometimes claimed is that the Church of England is distinctive in forming a liturgy out of its pre-Reformation traditions. I wonder if we can just sort of challenge or some of those points and look at how the Book of Common Prayer comes into being in both its 1549 version and its 1552 version, because there are these two key editions that appear in the reign of Edward.
Yes, well, the story, as you delicately hinted, is one of wishful thinking on the part of Anglican historians. It is not unique in Europe. The Church of Sweden has a rather similar evolution of a liturgy, which actually did end up Lutheran. But England's didn't. 1549 was already imbued by Cranmer's skepticism about the real presence. Then it was revised in conversation with refugees such as Butzer, Marta, Waski, towards a new edition, 1552, which broadly speaking, it was the prayer book which marched on to be the 1662 book, the definitive version of the English Rite. And there's one crucial thing about the Holy Communion service in the 1552 version of what Cranmer did, and it's what you do with bread and wine left over after the communion service has taken place. There will probably always will be some bread and wine left over. And this stage direction is technically called a rubric at the end of the service. It says, well, the curate shall have it to his own use, which means that he can take it home for his tea,
Mm-hmm.
for his supper. Now, you don't do that to the body and blood of Christ. You do it to bread and wine which have had a use in the service but no longer have a use. Now, that's crucial. It shows that the Book of Common Prayer and the form created at the end of the reign of Edward VI, still the Rite of 1662, was conceived of in a reformed mode and not in a Lutheran mode, let alone a traditionalist Catholic mode.
Mm-hmm. And we can also talk about the physical arrangement of churches. This is something that I know students of liturgy and ordinands are trained about, that what is sometimes said is that the 1552 book places the communion table arranged east and west, as it were, lengthways along the church. Sometimes it's in the chancel, but sometimes it's not even within the sacred priest's space, is it?
No, they couldn't decide,
Mm.
and I don't think the decision was properly made under Edward. It was under Elizabeth. One of the likely outcomes of Edward's regimes, where you used the church in two halves. You have the people's half, the nave, technically, in which morning and evening prayer were said, Sunday by Sunday. And then increasingly and frequently, the other half of the church, the chancel, was in use for communion services, separated by a screen, the remains of the medieval rood screen, now called a partition. And that remained the way that churches were used in England, really through to the 18th century. And it's a way of using all the medieval fabric, but in two very contrasting ways. One for morning and evening prayer, the other for Holy Communions. Probably by the end of Elizabeth's reign, Queen Elizabeth's reign, no more than 2 or 3 times a year.
Mm.
I'm thinking about how the ambiguities that we've sort of hinted at in the ways that Cranmer is masterful in being politique and diplomatic. And as I think about how the the Church of England at this state is kind of ingenious in a lot of ways in these kind of ambiguities, and we'll see this further on in Elizabeth's reign. I don't want to leap there quite yet, but I suppose that leaves it open to discontent and people wanting to clarify certain positions, and we'll see that later on in the story when people feel that it isn't sufficiently reformed.
Mhm.
And they want to continue it to continue to reform the Book of Common Prayer. And I think a lot of this hinges on what were Edward's intentions. Were they
Mhm.
finished in 1552 or were they going to keep going? And that open question that Dermot, just I love that final chapter in his book, The Boy King, is he talks about how the Elizabethan discontents are really arguing about what were Edward's intentions. And
Mm.
had he lived longer, what would he have liked to see? And that is the question that I think continues to remain open for debate, and I think gives a lot of insight into the question of worship that does make England stand out because it remains unsettled for over a century and longer in a way that just does not happen in the same way on the continent. And it's precisely this resolved question that gives the kind of ecclesiological depth and richness to the traditions in England as they develop. Confessional constructions, a lot that people later down the line will say makes England distinctive. And that their Reformation is uniquely positioned in a way by the 17th century to answer questions in a way that their counterparts are not. So they start to take it as a badge of distinction, the fact that they have not, or that they've continued on speaking about these questions on a level that is unparalleled.
Mm.
Mm.
I wonder if I can follow on from what you've just been saying, Polly, a little bit to talk about what happens after Edward VI's reign. Because, of
Mm.
course, Edward dies tragically young in 1553, and some of the leaders of the English Reformation elect to stay in the country, most famously Cranmer, but also Latimer, Hooper, Nicholas Ridley, and a number of those who are not bishops, and uh, a number of those leaders of the church and also ordinary laymen and women choose not to surrender their faith, but actually are executed as heretics under Mary. But we know of about 800 households that go to the continent, and those include quite a number of the leaders of the church as it will take shape under Elizabeth I after her accession in 1558. There's a famous dispute over the Book of Common Prayer and over the liturgy that takes place in one of the exile churches, which is in Frankfurt in central Western Germany. There's a rather interesting irony here. Back in the reign of Edward, there was an exile community of people who had come over from the Netherlands, which was looked after by a French-speaking Reformed pastor called Valéran Poulain. Now, Poulain leaves under Mary and finds himself in Frankfurt ministering to the French-speaking congregation of Reformed in Frankfurt. And then the English turn up, first of all, a group of English, including the Scotsman John Knox, and they ask permission to form a congregation, and they share the French exiles' church. And they're told, this is okay as long as you're French Reformed. And they say, well, okay. Then another group of exiles arrive, uh, traditionally supposed to be associated with the future Bishop of Ely, Richard Cox, and they start to integrate into the worship of the English exiles bits of the Book of Common Prayer which were regarded by the exiles as inappropriate. There's a bit of a debate over whether you should have responses, versicles and responses in the liturgy. There's a debate over certain things which had always been a little bit doubtful in relation to rings in marriage, cross in baptism, even the vestments of the clergy. That's going to be a big debate under Elizabeth. Now, the intriguing thing is Richard Cox and some of his friends, Thomas Lever, Thomas Beacon, a number of people who had worked with Cranmer, who had gone abroad, and who would later play major roles in Elizabeth's church, they do something really rather unpleasant. And they warn the magistrates of Frankfurt that John Knox has written some very rude things about the Holy Roman Emperor and Mary and her husband Philip. And so they get Knox kicked out. But what's intriguing is that we have a liturgy which is believed to have been the work of Cox and his friends after they had Knox out of the way, after they got these super radical reformed Genevan style worshippers out of the way. And even that is considerably moved on from the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. It
Mm.
leaves out a lot of the contentious things, still has the versicles and responses, but a lot of the other stuff is gone. So we can reasonably infer that when these Frankfurt folk come back to England under Elizabeth, they're thinking, oh, let's continue the job. Let's continue the work
Absolutely.
of Reformation.
I think
That's crucial. Mm.
yeah, no, I think the idea that the context of how one is situating the Book of Common Prayer in exile changes. The coordinates
Mhm.
change. You see this again in the mid 17th century, where people like John Cousin and others who want to emphasize certain things in the face of what they see as excessively zealous Protestantism, moderate themselves when they go to the continent. And I think the same happens here in Frankfurt, where you have a different context. They're desperately trying to mediate and find a compromise. And the idea that Cox is able to knocks out and Knox is goes to Geneva, is that a victory, or does it actually in some ways show that, had they reached some kind of agreement,
Mm.
then you wouldn't have had the kind of radicalization go that where a huge number ended up in Geneva that otherwise would have been in Frankfurt and had a more moderate vision. And I think the story there with Knox going, we all know what happens in Geneva is that Knox and Christopher Goodman are going to publish very radical resistance treatises, which alongside a new form of a Book of Common Prayer, which is going to connect liturgical reform with political sedition in a very direct, explicit way. That will actually, in some ways, move this question forward in terms of how one thinks about the liturgical reform in relationship to supremacy. So, in some ways, there's kind of mixed results that fall out of this inability to reach a settlement in Frankfurt.
This period really of exile is really crucial to our story. Here are English people in exile debating amongst themselves about a possible future if Queen Mary died. They don't know she's going to die very soon. She, in fact, did. And so they're all able to come back into the next reign, that of Queen Elizabeth, having had these really quite poisonous arguments. And we must remember that all these arguments are between Reformed Protestants. We can forget Lutheranism from now
Mhm.
on, except that the authorities in Frankfurt were Lutherans and they'd been rather kind in allowing hospitality to any of these Reformed characters. But now the future in England and the church in England is going to be a future which is an argument, a conversation among Reformed Protestants.
Absolutely. And
And yet, at the same time, there is a sense in which the excesses of Reformed is clearly there in Elizabeth's mind. She is put off by what happened in Geneva because
mhm.
she's been, female monarchy has been attacked in explicit terms
Yeah.
through the first blast that Knox publishes. And so there's a sense in which you have this Reformed culture that is not sitting entirely well with the Queen because
Mm.
of the political implications. And so there's a sense in which it's going to have a different character.
Yeah.
Once more, we ought to name Zurich. We've not mentioned the fact
Hmm.
that some of these English exiles from Mary went to Zurich, and it was the happiest and most harmonious of all the exile experiences. And many of those who came back from Zurich into England in 1559 went on to be bishops.
Hmm.
So from now on, you can say there is a sort of establishment or Zurich version of Reformed Protestantism around which the Church of England was created.
Hmm.
It continued with Edward's Book of Common Prayer, more or less unaltered, but around that, bishops increasingly behaved as if they were the head of the church in Zurich,
Mm.
within the terms which Elizabeth set them.
And interestingly, of course, the Zurich church was, people argue about how true this is, how extreme it is, but Zurich was one place where you don't get a lot of conflict between church and city. They seem to
Mm.
manage to get along. So Bullinger shows, Bullinger, the leader of the church at Zurich, shows that you can have quite radical Reformed theology, but maybe without the subversive tones which Polly has quite rightly drawn attention to in the wake of Geneva. And of
This
course,
is
Yeah,
why, this is why Bullinger becomes the empire when they, in Elizabeth's reign, start to fight over the vestments. He is
mhm,
umpiring that debate.
yep.
yes, and he's acceptable to Elizabeth, who sent him a communion cup, which is still there in the city of Zurich. It's a rare thing for Elizabeth to give expensive presents to anybody, let alone a reformed theologian. So she clearly thought, okay, Zurich's all right. It's a sort of a model for the church I would set up in England.
And of course, key texts by the Zurich reformers end up being translated into English and published
Mm.
with the church's sanction. I wonder, we're almost coming to the end of our time. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the New World, because there is also a story there to be told of refuge and travel and changing contexts. Polly, do you want to say
Sure.
what on
So we've been talking about how there are these different experiences that come back to Elizabeth's reign, where you have exiles who are coming from abroad, coming to the Elizabethan Church, who are contesting the question, certain elements in the Book of Common Prayer. And that is fine until John Whitgift is Archbishop, and in 1583 poses three articles, the second of which will really force the matter to come to a head because the clerics are need to subscribe to the idea that there's nothing contrary to Scripture in the Book of Common Prayer, and that is where you see this case of conscience conflicting many of those who do believe there are elements that are not there in Scripture, or even contradictory. And we have a number of those who want for the reform, like Thomas Cartwright, Walter Travers, going abroad, really coinciding in the 1570s, even before Whitgift. And the problem is that there's a shift now because there are religious wars. You have the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where all of these Protestants are being slaughtered, and that shifts the sense of urgency to identify with the Reformed cause and Calvinists who are under assault on the continent. And that therefore it's no coincidence that in 1572, with the wake of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, that you have Puritans launching a very virulent attack called the Admonition to Parliament on the English liturgy, arguing that the dial needs to move further. And this is where you get some of the most colorful language, calling it, all sorts of things as remnants from the Catholic tradition. And it's there that we get these open public debates about liturgical reform that will continue on. And some of this is framed again, of course, on the continent because these Puritan dissenters still see themselves as part of the Church of England. They
Right.
do not see themselves as separating. And in fact, you have a number of Cartwright and even Henry Jacob arguing against those who have called the Church of England altogether false over the liturgy. And they have basically argued that the third identifying mark of the church, not just the sacraments and the preaching of the word, but now church discipline are a third mark of the true church. And because the Church of England doesn't have it, it's a false church. And so these separatists who reject the church altogether are being denounced by fellow Puritans who are disagreeing with them on that point. The interesting thing here is that someone like Henry Jacob, who is attacking separatists, Francis Johnson in the 1590s, under King James I, when Elizabeth breathes her last, and King James I from Scotland comes to the English throne, their hopes are high because he was a master at thinking that giving everyone these hopes that he was going to either give more leniency or allow for there to be further revisions to the Book of Common Prayer. He allows a new translation, but in fact, alongside some of these concessions, which are very minor and not really addressing the key issues, like the ring in marriage and the cross in baptism, he enforces a greater conformity in his new canons. And this is what's going to lead a new form that is incredibly novel, which is the idea that the Church of England is not a national church. It is simply a composite of individual parishes. And so these Congregationalists who have this crisis of conscience believe that they are no longer separating, but they can worship according to their conscience by simply taking the Church of England as a national church and nominalizing it into a plurality of parishes. So they're not separatists, but they are autonomous. And this leads to this new strand of congregational autonomy, which is what it gets exported out to the New World. And it's interesting because precisely they still see themselves, they do not see the point that they are separatists. They continue to debate the liturgy even when they're in the New World. And you have people like John Ball arguing over them about whether it's possible to have a stinted liturgy or not. And what we have are a whole range of liturgical views in the New World, where you have even some Presbyterians there in Newbury and in Hingham, Massachusetts, where they still want to hold on to elements of the Book of Common Prayer, even among those Puritan migrants. Obviously, there's a big debate over extemporary prayer and wanting more leeway. And this is where the debate starts to continue to evolve. And this idea of wanting a purity of worship is certainly something that we see. I think, Heiko Oppermann said that the Reformed religion on the continent was a religion of refugees.
Mm.
And John Coffey, I think, beautifully wrote about how the Puritan Reformation was a reformation of refugees and exile in many ways, because they identified specifically with moments of exile in scriptures. And this goes all the way back under Queen Mary and beyond, when there's certain patterns in Israel's history of exile that the Puritans are latching onto. But what's important to note here is that it's not just simply in Egypt, and it's not just simply the Babylonian captivity. When they are in exile in Amsterdam or elsewhere, they're meeting rabbis who have over a millennia of tradition of exile, this sense of diaspora. And there are certain patterns in their religiosity that develop post-Second Temple, in the post-Second Temple, where they move away from the priest and from the temple to the law and the teaching and a direct intimacy with the divine. That gets woven into that Puritan experiment. So I just wanted to mention this idea that there is a longer story of exile, diaspora, refuge that is not just cherry-picked from certain biblical examples, but is in fact in conversation directly with other religious exiles and those who are they're meeting in Amsterdam and elsewhere. Which
Thank you.
means that this challenges the idea of this Anglo-American exceptionalism,
Yeah.
that this is a story that of course the English see themselves in some ways in unique covenant, but it's not exclusionary.
Thank you so much. Now, I think we need to come to a conclusion. I think this is a good point. Thank you very much indeed, Polly, for that, as it were, theological insight. We need to think about how, for these founders of a tradition, the ability to receive those who were in refuge and the ability to be the church in refuge was an important part of who they were. Any concluding thoughts on that? Dermot?
Oh, You put it very well, and we've given lots of examples of that in the 16th century. If we had the time, we could go on into the mid 17th century,
Hmm.
when those who began to think of themselves as Anglicans were again in exile, alongside the exiled king, the Stuart king, who became Charles II. Very much of what later Anglicans think of as Anglicanism was created by the experience of suffering and exile in the 1650s. And that was the mood in which the Book of Common Prayer of 1662 was created. So all these stages in the history of the Church of England, which became the basis for an Anglican worldwide communion, at all these stages for 150 years, exile, refugee status is absolutely essential to the story.
I suppose my concluding thoughts would be that the Church of England's history is a long story of this engagement with the broader conversations, and that it was sharpened and enriched, and that theologically speaking, we see so much that develops out of that constant engagement, even,
Hmm.
not only in receiving, but then also traveling and bringing back. And so this sense in which even those who seem to be the most, kind of radical on the end of dissent are continuing to have this conversation. And it is, takes us back to that Republic of Letters, but the church seen as united and continued to be connected as a body is what really continue to facilitate that. And in their own minds, they're not thinking, even when they're claiming a degree of autonomy, they're still in very much in communion with those, even across the Atlantic and across the North Sea.
Indeed, yes, yes. Refuge does not necessarily break the bounds of amity and the sense of siblinghood, as it were, between those different communities. Thank you both very much indeed. Looking at the time, I think we should probably conclude this recording, and I look forward very much to moving on to the next stage of the conversation. So I'll pause the recording now. Thank you again.